and that will benefit those who aren't able to join us, because I know there were many who were unable because of conflicts. We're going to use the chat function to indicate if you have a desire to jump into the conversation, just to help us manage numbers. But I think the way we'll work it with this size group this evening, which is a lovely size, is that as I see you expressing an interest to speak through chat, I'll invite you to unmute yourself. So please, everyone, stay muted until you jump into the conversation, and use that chat function, which you'll find as you scroll along the bottom of your screen. You'll find your mute there. If you do prefer to stay behind the camera instead of in front of it, you can keep your video clicked off, or feel free to jump in, your choice. And we're going to start with some stories and experience telling from Warren, but then we'll move into much more of a conversation, and I will do my best to monitor chat. So as folks have comments they'd like to offer, or questions you'd like to pose, either to Warren or to invite into the whole room, I'll look for your name on and then invite you to speak. And I've already had one chat request, which is for Warren to adjust your camera a little bit so we can see your whole face. Ah, there.
You don't want to see my whole face. No. Is that okay?
That is perfect. Right. So without any further ado, I want to say a couple of words of welcome cool. to our guest speaker tonight, Master Coach Warren Redman, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know a little bit as we were getting ready. Hello. His journey has been a fascinating one, and it has been a journey from what he has shared with me, and I know he's going to share much more about that this evening. And it is rich with extraordinary coaching experiences and accomplishments that include, setting up the Center for Inner Balancing, which was later named the Emotional Fitness Institute, first in Calgary back in the 60s, about 20 some years into his initial journey into coaching, and now thrives with other leaders and other leader coaches here on the East Coast. He is a renowned author, including many, many books in the field of coaching, one of which, The 9 Steps to Emotional Fitness, won the award for the best counseling book from the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. And that storytelling theme, and Warren as master coach, Warren as storytelling, I think is perhaps something that we may see woven together beautifully tonight, because his writing is not just nonfiction, but now increasingly fiction. And he is currently president of the Writers Federation of New Brunswick, which I suspect is a whole other chapter in the rich story. And so Warren made the comment to me that he's going to open up his treasure box of mysteries and use storytelling as a bit of a frame. So I am delighted to welcome you, Warren, on behalf of all of the coaches in the region, and particularly those here this evening. And I think we're in for some great stories. So over to you, please.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. And first of all, to say, obviously, as you've already learnt from me, that mastery does not include mastery of technology. So you can only be a master of one or two things, not of everything. I will, as Michelle says, tell something of my own journey through some stories of my own. On the way, my journey through the MCC maze, really, I could see it. And I encourage anyone to jump in any time, really. If you have a question to ask or a comment to make, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. I'm fine with that, because I do, after all, respond, I think, probably better to people than just spouting on. And the danger would be, if you don't stop me, I might just keep going on. So it's open anytime for a question of, you go through Michelle. Michelle will let me know if someone wants to talk. Okay. So, well, I'll call this my journey through the MCC maze because it seemed quite a maze. First of all, ICF has been going since, what is it, 1995, I think. There are over 30,000 coaches worldwide now, so it's still a fairly young, in professional organization terms, but growing massively organization. And as far as I know, in the Atlantic Canada region, there still is only me, and that's not even true now, as an MCC. So I hope others will step in the same direction. I felt a bit lonely, I must say, for the first couple of years, being the one MCC in the whole region. So I'll talk about my story, not because it was an easy one, but because actually it was an adventure in the end. I decided to apply to become an MCC, notwithstanding the fact I had no other accreditation with the ICF. Because I've been doing it for a long time, I thought, why not jump into the whole thing instead of going to ACC and then PCC and then becoming MCC. I don't think you can do that anymore, but certainly in 2013 when I applied, there were no restrictions on that. So I jumped in under that gate, I think. But in a way, I think the process for applying for that accreditation is similar, just at each step you need to have more under your belt and more hours, obviously, and it takes longer. So I think the first thing I would say is, don't be as deterred as I was when I first looked at what the requirements were, because when I started looking at everything, my first reaction was, I don't think so. There was an awful lot there. So I had another reaction. And of course, I was helped in my decision taking by another coach. That's the way it works, folks, in coaching. It's easy to go round in circles, just trying to think or outthink or second guess yourself. So sit down with someone else and help you think through what you need to be doing. Why not use coaching if you're a coach? Yes, you guys.
Warren, sorry, I'm Bobby. Hi. How long did you have to, let's say, premeditate on possibly getting an MCC before you actually started taking action? And I say that was like, so this is not something you had after I do this and this, then I'll go for my MCC. This was something that, wasn't something you were percolating on for a long time career-wise. I'm trying to think how long you had to kind of warm up attitude and view-wise to that.
Okay. Well, let me see. I think I can answer that by saying, but first of all, oddly enough, I didn't see it as an advancement of my own career. The strange thing is, I think I started on the MCC trail when I was pretty much deciding that I was going to be finishing my career as a coach. So I'm kind of a little bit off kilter in that way. You know, I often got the training after I'd been doing things for a few years, or got accredited for something after I thought I'd really need to move on to something else. So, but that wasn't the main initial motivation. I'll get around to answering your question. The motivation was that the organization, Emotional Fitness Institute, and then followed on by an Emotional Fitness Center, the whole stories in that, was really looking at becoming approved to run an ICF accredited course. In order to do that, one of the things it needed was to have an MCC engaged who would be acting as a mentor. Well, there aren't any other MCCs around. We could have had someone from wherever else, Calgary, because I knew a lot of people in Calgary. So I decided that it would be, number one, helpful to have someone locally who could do that. And number two, it would be a really good thing for me to test myself out and go through that process. How long did it probably took, I don't know, the idea was percolating for maybe 9 months to a year. I didn't seriously.
That seems relatively short, so that's actually encouraging.
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's the first bit. Having decided after about that time, it then took me some while to go about looking at it, because as I said earlier, my first reaction in looking at the requirements was, this is just too big to contemplate. Okay. So it probably took several more months before I really got down to it. And then I don't know how long, I think the process took up to 9 months to a year to go through the whole process, probably closer to a year, I think. So from start to finish, you could say, I think I should do an MCC. To getting the MCC was probably about 2 years. Okay.
That's awesome.
So can I ask, do you have an accreditation now?
Yeah, so I have my ACC, and I think
Okay.
I'm about halfway to my PCC.
Oh, very good.
And definitely, I would, when the time comes, I'll get it. So the streams for me is that I'm going for a cluster of my PMP and kind of agile and other PMI, like project management certifications,
Yeah.
and then the coaching one. I thought, you know what, probably 2 regulatory bodies is probably enough to get involved in. There's other cool stuff if you want to spec into HR or management consulting or whatever particular, my focus is EQ, so there's added stuff in that realm. But I mean, you don't want to get, I've also looked at people that just have a long chain of them. A lot of them are often finance, accounting, and management people. And at some point it becomes like, do you practice and use all of those? Like your a dozen different letters after your name at some point are low ROI.
Yeah. So in a way you can chop off all the ones that aren't relevant anymore, and just put the one that you really feel attached to.
Yes.
And personally, I felt at the end really happy that I'd chosen to go straight into the MCC and not, done all those steps along the way. As I say, I don't think you can do that now, but you could then. And there's I don't know, there was something in me that when I read all the stuff and looked at all the requirements, it was a bit like this. Well, I think anyone who's coaching really should be coaching at MCC level.
Yeah.
I thought of it this way. Would I want to go to a dentist or a brain surgeon who just kind of gone halfway along the route? Right? I don't think so. So
I'm glad you said that from a culture standpoint, because that's one of the reasons I not only I got my certification myself, but I push every coach to do it. And when I see coaches that not only don't, but they have no appetite for it, it immediately is a signal for me of like, what kind of professional culture do you want to pull? Wait a minute, do you not want to be professional? Do you not want to be accountable? Yeah. It's a real red flag.
Yes. Okay. So having taken the decision, then going the whole hog, whether you need to take it in steps, if it takes 5 years or whatever. But I believe now increasingly that coaches are well advised, if for no other reason than the greater sense of competence and of quality work, and of doing the work at the level you really want it to be doing it at. If that's the only reason. There are other more increasingly, I think, compelling reasons, because I think certainly not too far hence, more and more potential clients, and I'm thinking more the corporate world, will be asking for and eventually insisting, because they will be out there, for the highest level they can get. So all other things being equal, if you've got an MCC in front of you, that would be the one they'd select. And why not? So
that'd be awesome.
There's that professional career reason too. Yeah. So so that in a way was what impelled me to go along in that path. I almost didn't. and until I asked myself the question, or at least with the help of my coach, asked myself the question, what do I need to do to make it really worthwhile for me? I chose, because I hadn't taken any of the formal accredited coach training, I chose to use the portfolio approach for two main reasons. One, the one I just mentioned, I didn't have the training from Royal Roads or any of the others. But I knew that I had a whole lot of experience and practice, and had worked on coaching before it was ever called coaching. I was doing something that I called, because there was no other name for it at the time, personal consulting, which wasn't quite consulting, wasn't quite counseling. It was something else, and we didn't have a name for it. There you are again. Yeah.
My apologies. I have to head off early. I realize I'm
Okay.
late for something. Good night, everyone. I'll see the recording next time. Bye.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I wanted to look at what the experience was that I'd had, and what that did was it really helped me to delve into that experience that I probably hadn't stopped long enough and looked at and wondered about in relation to the skills and competencies I had, which would satisfy an organization like the International Coach Federation. So it was that was the amazing journey. It was the bit that I enjoyed the most. And whatever else you do, if you think of applying for any level of accreditation for the ICF, and in particular perhaps for MCC at some stage, take that journey. If it's anything like the discoveries I made, you will discover the quite extraordinary things that you've done along the way, that actually, if we think somewhat out of the box and we're quite creative with it, really fit in, and we can demonstrate that they fit in to the requirements that the ICF had, which looked pretty daunting, not just as requirements, but the range and the explanations of things. So I looked at my training, which started, I guess, in the 60s and 70s. I'm incredibly old, 60s and 70s, and had nothing to do with coaching, because there wasn't such a thing. Had more to do with counseling, because that's what attracted me, and community development kind of work. But what really interested me in working with individuals and fascinated me, and what I learned from, was how much of their wisdom they brought to me. Much of my training, in part, had been about how I could help, how I could interpret what people brought to the table. So it's kind of psychologically based, and how I could not make diagnoses per se, but actually consider the kind of plan that I would have for them. Until I came across the psychotherapist, American psychotherapist Carl Rogers, whose name you may have heard of if you haven't delved into some of his work. I mean, he practiced in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, wrote a book called On Becoming a Person, which helped me become my own person. It was one of those books that I probably read with my mouth agape most of the time, recognizing that what I was doing had some basis for real professional practice. And he called his approach person-centered or client-centered, but I preferred the person-centered counseling. So although he had deep training in psychology, and psychotherapeutic practices at those times, emanating from people like the early ones, Freud and so on, he recognized that all he had to do was, well, to have empathy with another person, listen to them very actively, and engage with their own inner wisdom, and something would happen. So I tried to emulate him. Well, I couldn't be Carl Rogers, but I did my best. And I practiced counseling for a while, and went on as many different counseling courses as I could. And then I met another man called Eugene Heimler, which again was a life-changing experience. I'd been counseling for maybe 10 years by then. I thought I was pretty good at that. I thought I was a pretty good listener. And I sat with that man for maybe 20 minutes, 40 minutes, let's say. And I went away wondering how he had listened at such a deep level in a way that helped me and the 3 others in the group that were with him come to significant decisions and actions about an issue that we'd taken to him. How did he do that, I thought? And I spent the next 7 years working with him, training with him and working with him on his approach, which he called human social functioning, and which formed, together with the Carl Rogers approach, the basis of my work from there, and helped me to really establish what I called at first inner balancing, as Michelle said, and subsequently emotional fitness, and develop tools derived from the way in which Eugene Heimler had listened and some of the work that we'd done. And then that was all in England. When I moved to Calgary in 1994, I started a practice which subsequently became emotional fitness, and set up the Emotional Fitness Institute, working with individuals. About 3 years on, I discovered that there was something called coaching. Not only was there something called coaching, but there was the beginning of the International Coach Federation at that time. And I saw that what I'd been doing was not so much counseling, was not really called personal consulting, but was in fact coaching. And what I'd been writing about for a long time appeared to be closer to coaching than anything else. It wasn't strictly speaking following the ICF requirements, but it was my way of doing it. So this is all about how I delved back into my past, and I started taking off the shelf some of the things I'd written in the early days. I wrote, so here's a show and tell thing. It was a small booklet out of a project I did called Creative Training, followed up by another small booklet called Guidelines for Finding Your Own Support. When I reread those after many years of having forgotten about them, I realized I was writing about coaching and what coaching was. I had no idea. There were other books, I won't show you all the books. I wrote a book when I first came to Calgary because I had little else to do, called Achieving Personal Success, which really outlined the work and the training I'd been doing. When I re-looked at it, looking at the MCC process, I realized most of that was about coaching and fitted in with what the ICF were asking for. I'd written other books, Counseling Your Staff, which was less about counseling and more about coaching and so on. And then I wrote a book, because I was asked to, called The 9 Steps to Emotional Fitness, and all these, and so that's the book that Michelle told you about, that was sent in, not by me, I have to say, to the Canadian Counselling and Psychotherapy Association for its book award. And it won. And it didn't win without a lot of dissent. And my sense of it was, because it was less about the more, shall I say, increasingly psychologically based approach to counseling, and more, I mean, it went back to my roots of Carl Rogers and Eugene Heimler, more towards the coaching approach. However, what I say, that the light rather than the dark side seemed to win on that, and the fact that that book was acknowledged as the counseling book of that year, or those 2 years, wasn't just a kind of boost to my own ego, but actually said something about an approach that maybe 50% of counselors really recognize as valid, but was more inclined towards the coaching approach. I was between.
Warren.
Yes.
Just on that point, there's you're starting to knit some things together that I know Christine is wondering about, and as you continue with this story, I wonder if Christine, you might just pop in with your question, because I think it's quite relevant to this piece of the story.
Pop in, Christine.
Hi, Warren. Well, I was just curious about, I don't have your book and I don't know if it's available, but I'd be interested to know whether or not you've integrated Carl Rogers' technique. And you've mentioned someone else. Now, I'm familiar with Carl Rogers, but not with the other psychologist that you've mentioned. So did you integrate that into the book? And I think maybe you might have answered that.
The answer is yes and yes. And the second name was Eugene Heimler.
Okay.
Okay. So in a way, I could hardly avoid integrating it into the book, because their approaches and their personas, in a way, well, I worked a long time with Heimler, became a part of me and my approach.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes, I assumed so, but I thought I would ask.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's quite a bit about them in there, and certainly the whole ethos and approach is drawn from their work, and I acknowledge that. Yeah.
So is the book still available to buy?
Yes, it is. Actually, I'm not sure how many there are right now. I think it's almost gone out of print, but more can be made available. I'm kind of looking up at the screen at Darren over there, because he knows probably more about that. But anyway, it would be available, I'm sure. Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
So, and I'm not doing this to sell you books. I'm going through saying what I did. These are part of my discovery. I read another book called Recipes for Inner Peace, which was much more for the lay person, not the practitioner, to say, well, what's the journey like when you actually go and see, and in this case, an emotional fitness coach? What happens? And so I got into really the storytelling part of that. So the client is the main character in that book, goes to see a coach, and it's her story. It was partly doing that made me decide in the end, I think I just want to be a writer. Because up until that point, I wasn't a writer. I just wrote books because it added to the profession that I was in. But then I realized I just want to be doing that. So in an odd way, delving into all this stuff to gain my MCC accreditation took me to a different place. I think there was one question I think that someone sent through, I don't know who it was, that was about, did it change your life? And I thought, well, no, not really. But now I'm saying, well, yes, it did. And I think I really can attribute it to the fact that my learning going through that MCC maze was such that it, ironically, took me out of coaching and into becoming a fiction writer. And for me, that's now perfect. Yeah. And at the same time, it helped to solidify the fact that after all, I have been doing work that just because I got a pin that says MCC on it kind of acknowledges all those years of doing stuff. So yeah, that was really part of that journey, and in a way I think I draw on and acknowledge the work of not just those two people that I work well, knew about and worked with, but many others. I was very fortunate in having some great teachers along the way. And probably most of the teachers I had weren't really there to be teachers, they were my clients. I think the greatest learning I had was from the people I worked with, who ostensibly were the clients while I was the coach. But as you know, the whole thing's a partnership. They bring their wisdom and their process and their discoveries, and along the way, various actions and changes and movements, and I learned from that every step of the way. So it's important to maintain that, yeah. If there are no other questions right now, I'll just carry on a little bit with the process I went through, because in discovering all the different approaches I'd used and the experience I had, one of the things I had to do was to find a mentor, another MCC. Well, there weren't any around here, but I knew several in Calgary, where I had been earlier before I came to New Brunswick, Shediac specifically. So I connected with one of them in Calgary, one of the ones I knew the best probably, who was a member of the same chapter that I was in Calgary. And I worked with her, and she invited me. So here's a little experience. She invited me to join on a telephone conference call 2 or 3 times with a little group of MCCs who got together, still do, I guess, on a monthly basis. So on the first call I had, one of them challenged me and asked me to do a bit of practice coaching, which I did. And I think the person who offered to be my client was the MCC who became my mentor later on. So I just did what I do. And at the end of the session, they said, "Oh, that was amazing. That was wonderful. You're a natural. I'm sure you'll have no problem being an MCC." So I think not long after that, month or 2 after that, when I'd really studied the requirements for competencies for the ICF, setting the foundation, establishing the coaching agreement, establishing trust and intimacy, and so on. I again practiced with my own MCC. So I became the coach, she was the client, and I was very conscious of the fact that I wanted to demonstrate these competencies. I think we did about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and I didn't have a good feeling about it. At the end, I thought, that was really terrible. And my MCC, who was the client for the purpose of the exercise, bless her, said to me, that was terrible. So it was kind of back to square one in a way. That was my first experience of really consciously trying to demonstrate that I had those competencies set out in all those pages for MCC requirements. So I put those two things together. I put together the fact that they really loved it when I just did what I did and was authentic. And it was really terrible when I forced it and tried to demonstrate that I had those competencies. I really had, that was when my work began. I studied the required competencies. And I asked myself, how does what I do already, I'd like to say it was natural, but it became natural after I really worked on my emotional fitness tools for many years. How does what I already do connect with and fit into those required competencies? And that's what I started to do. And when I saw that, I was able simply to use those processes, being very conscious of the fact that on the one hand were the requirements, on the other hand was my experience, my way of being, my way of doing, if you like, and how those fit in. And it became much more natural. I had to, I think they were just audio required mostly, although I think I did do a video of a couple of them. And I did quite a few. And I think it was 2 had to be submitted, and I just picked the 2 that seemed to be the best, and went through the process. I think, if I recall correctly, I did not succeed fully in my first application. They asked me to resubmit something. It may have been another recording, which I redid. So it's not all plain sailing. Well, the whole thing wasn't plain sailing. It was plain sailing when I really looked into my own experience and studied what I was doing, rather than think I have to study what they want. Yeah, and for me, it's about how do I really integrate what they're saying on these pieces of paper. And the other thing is, you know, I certainly at the beginning and up to halfway through the whole process, which was a longish, fairly arduous process, I began to think of ICF as you know, a faceless set of bureaucratic people asking almost impossible things. And when I really connected with them and spoke to some of them, I thought, well, just like us. They're coaches who just want to be engaged in and professional about doing this work. And they've struggled as much as anyone to get these competencies out. And they welcome anyone going through the whole process, and they're there to help. So that unlocked another barrier for me of thinking of them as faceless judges who are going to decide whether I'm worthy or not. So that helped to fill the gap and make the process easier for me. Any other questions before?
Warren, perhaps not a question, more of just an observation. I'm fascinated by these threads of knowing and appreciating what I already have,
Right.
which you spoke about so beautifully in the journey back through the early years, starting with the training, but because you are a writer, having distilled so much of your work and your practices in those books, you had this beautiful, almost a library, if you will, of your contributions. And then to hear also how, relative to the competency work and the demonstration, that I loved how you expressed that notion of start with what I have, what I already bring.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's such a powerful offering. Thank you.
Well, and thank you for giving that back to me. And the odd thing is that part of the whole process of emotional fitness and of course of coaching is for us to learn from our experience and start with what we have there. And it took me a while because I was just going through I was just struggling with all the paperwork. Took me a while to realize, well, that's what I offer. Why don't I apply it to myself here? And of course, not all of us have books that we've written but we all have the experience that could be books if we wanted them to be, and don't need to be, as long as we delve back into our history and discover what we have. It was helpful for me. I mean, I learned a lot by simply writing it down. Different people will learn in different ways. So how do we learn from things? One of the other things that happened, this was a wonderful part of the journey. You know, how many hours of coaching practice have you had? I don't know how many it is that you're asked to do for the MCC. I've forgotten now, but it's a couple of thousand hours or something, 2,500 hours, I believe. Well, this seemed too big to be possible. And all my records from the UK, I'd got rid of when I came to Calgary, first of all. But I had all my records from Calgary onwards, so from 1995 or 6 onwards, when I really started my practice up, which included individuals and group coaching, or group training and coaching. So, and I put those together. The amazing experience of going back and looking at the contracts that we developed with each of those individuals. So in the emotional fitness contract work, the contract is defined and devised in this way. We sit down with someone who's interested in looking at emotional fitness, whether as an individual or as in a group practice, and ask 2 basic questions. What is it that you personally want to achieve from this? And a related one, what do you professionally want to achieve? And those are the questions. And we spend an hour in a way demonstrating what the coaching process is. So they get an experience of what it feels like and looks like, and come out with their own answers. So we write those down, they write theirs down, we write a copy of what they've written down and what their commitment is that they want to make in terms of time and financially. That's all written down. So we keep a record of that. I have in my drawer still, somewhere, anyway, in the archives, records of hundreds of those. Well, the fun I had reading them all, after some of them 20 years. Not only that, but as I was compiling all this stuff, and it no longer became a real drudge, but a joy, reading the stuff, remembering those people, remembering where they started and where they'd moved on to. I had an email sent to me, a letter, I think I have it somewhere here. May have gone now. Oh no, here it is. I had a letter from England. I'll start it. This is classic. Hello, Warren. You probably don't remember me, but between 1985 and 1987, you provided me with some very useful coaching sessions, which is interesting because we didn't call it coaching then. I was unhappy with my job performance as a trainer and was considering becoming a garden designer. When I immediately remembered him, of course, at that point. You'll be pleased to know that I continued as a trainer until retiring at the end of last year, and garden design is a very pleasurable hobby. I am contacting you as my eldest son, Tom, aged 34, seems to be having the same problems that I was having. Lack of confidence in considering a career change, and so on. Well, I remembered him, of course, not least because I'd written more about him and an assumed name and so on. And the other thing I recalled was that while his son was at that time 34, he was 34 when I worked with him. So his son was about 40, it was 30 years ago. So that came out of the blue, and I added it to my MCC application. So what became a real difficult task at the beginning became an absolute labor of love towards the end, because it brought me two things. It brought me back to the people that I'd worked with, first and foremost, and it brought me back to the development stages I'd been to along the way. And remember, this is the portfolio approach. So my application was based on that rather than on any training I'd had. I did describe the training I'd had from Eugene Heimler, which was not coach specific, because there was no such thing. But when I looked at what we'd done, I then applied it to the requirements that the ICF has. It's not, after all, as though they invented them all. What they did was they put together those things that they'd drawn from other professions and their own experiences and said, these are our ethical requirements. These are the competences we believe fit into being a coach. The one thing I was kind of stuck on was and this is a continuing debate, the distinction they make between what they see as counseling and personal development and coaching. For me, I see no distinction, because what I have in front of me is a person. What they bring is what they bring. Since coaching doesn't, and I certainly never do, offer them any interpretation of what they're doing or advice for what they should do, or analyze what's going on, I'm simply able to help them hear what it is they have to offer, what the questions are that they have for themselves, to get to the essence of what it is they want to be doing, and to make their decisions and take their action. They always seem to do that. And if they need to delve into some of the blockages that they have because of prior experiences, then that's what they need to do. What we need to do is have the tools to help them do that. So
that's such a beautiful commentary on the bodies of work on which that work we now call coaching really rests, and what some of those roots represent. So I can tell, Warren, that you have enough stories to last us for many webinars, and so I'm just going to jump in to just check time for everyone. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to ensure that if there are a couple of more really key and juicy things that you want to share, that we hear those. And I also want to really invite the spellbound participants on the call who are, I think, hanging on every word. But if there are some questions or areas that folks want to hear a little bit more about, don't be shy, jump in, and let's just open it up for a minute to see if there's something that someone wants to ask.
Darren.
Hi, Warren. Warren, I was wondering if you can touch a little bit more on the client-centered approach of coaching and the necessity of the coach to do their own work to stay with that process, stay out of the way.
As I said, my first inkling of how important that was came from the Carl Rogers approach back in the 60s, I guess. And it's no less true, it's even stronger over the years. And certainly, as I'm very happy to see, is within the practice of coaching. Client-centered, person-centered, recognizing that the wisdom is within the person in front of you, is the essence of what we do. Having said that, what gets in the way always is us. because we also have our wisdom, and we have our stories, and we have our way of doing things, and we have our experiences, which often can coincide or seem to be similar to what the client brings. And if we get in the way, then we'll obstruct the ability for that client to draw out his or her own wisdom. And the only way I think, and the only way I know, at any rate, that we can get out of the way is for us to continually do our own work. We have to have the coach in front of us who can listen it out of us too. We don't use our clients for that, right? Peer coaching is a really good way of experiencing that, actually. So even now, occasionally I come up with a brilliant idea to know exactly what the person in front of me needs to be doing. And I need to listen to myself and what's going on there and put it out of the way, because it's only a brilliant idea for me. So even if the person says, well, what would you do in my position? Well, I'm not. And even if I were, I would still be me, not you. Yeah. So the question has to go back. So the client-centered or person-centered approach, or regarding the individual as the one with the real wisdom, is much easier said than done. We cannot learn it by anything other than experiencing our own selves and getting our own stuff out of the way, because we'll be triggered constantly if we don't take care of that. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Darren?
That's perfect, Warren. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren.
Since there's no other questions, this point that you had mentioned, Warren, kind of was re-emphasized Saturday night when I went and watched a play with Wendy, and as cast was a part of the particular play, and it was called Psychosis. And the essence of Psychosis was a girl who was in the psychiatric unit, and the interaction between the psychiatrist and the client. And it came to a point where she, as the patient, told the psychiatrist, if you really want to know what's wrong with me, how about you just ask me?
Well, there's a novel idea. Yes. Yeah.
Something. Warren, I know that as well, you may want to say more on that, but I know as well, Christine is
Yes.
is key to say something, and then we have a question from Dora. So
Okay.
we
Yes.
have a little bit of a lineup.
All right.
Okay, so I'm not even sure that I know exactly what I want to say, other than it's helped me to hear your background, Warren, in terms of your thoughtful experiences and what you've been exposed to has really been validating for me, because sometimes I question, that I'm not corporate enough, and so. But I work with many corporate individuals, and I currently have many CEOs, and I think I don't have a lack of confidence going into the call with them. But when I explain to somebody else outside of the maybe in the coaching world, a fellow coach, it's not corporate driven. It's really whole person driven, and so I feel a little bit like I'm an outlier. I sit on the outskirts of, I think, a common coach. I'm not, I don't need the results oriented. I don't get to that crazy action plan. It's more about, tell me what's happening with you. I study a lot of Eastern philosophy and psychiatry, psychology, neurology. I pull all those learnings in. And I feel like it's such a, I come out of the meeting feeling like something just magical has happened. And And it's very difficult to explain, but I think it's because of what I exposed my mind to in terms of my reading and my experiences and my travels and that kind of thing. And I think all those things have helped me to become a much richer, deeper listener. But it is difficult to explain that. And I have, I think, held myself back from working in the corporate world because of that, although I've had lots of people, individuals who come to me through referrals. So I feel like I bring meaning, like really some deep, deep meaning to the coaching, but it's difficult to explain, to go out and talk to corporate world about that.
Okay.
So, but I'm happy. I'm happy just doing my own thing for now and getting the referrals, and then maybe I might write a book at some point in time.
I hear a book there, Christine. And maybe it starts with but maybe the title is "It's Difficult to Explain." Because so it's hard to explain what you're doing to someone who doesn't understand what the whole process is. Oftentimes, you know, I've heard people say, well, he or she is a wonderful coach. What do they do? Nothing. The nothing that they're doing is the magic. Okay. So I really didn't want to tell my story to say how wonderful I am. I wanted to tell my story for you to connect with yours. None of us, I think, come to be a coach out of nothing. We've all had an amazing journey to get where we are, and they're all different. They're all unique. And the CEOs that you're working with, that's their job, to run their organizations. Nobody listens to them, not in the way that you may listen to them. And that's what makes the difference. And the more of those leaders who talk to other leaders and say, you know, what's made the difference in our organization is one very simple thing. I have someone who will listen to me.
Warren, conscious of time, but I know that Dora's got a question that,
Yes.
in a way, perhaps may build from this corporate theme. And thanks, Christine, for sharing that perspective. Excuse me, Dora, do you want to chime in and talk about your question?
Chime in, sure. So I loved your description of your clients and your relationships and so on. I work with mainly corporate clients, and I find that sometimes when the person has been told that they're going to get a coach, and that they need a coach, and that they have to go to a coach, and I end up being that coach, the relationship has a different beginning. Certainly. It may have a very similar end as others that seek themselves coaching, but it's a challenge unto itself. Have you ever experienced that?
Yes. Yes, it's the "you need coaching" syndrome. Who wants to be told that? So the relationship building is the tough one, isn't it, Dora? In a way, it always has to happen. It's just harder, as you say then. But if what you said is the end result is the same, that's all you need.
Yeah. But people start from behind a wall, right? They start from a defensive position. And I don't necessarily, I'm not 100% able to to reach out far enough to bring that person with me along in a relationship all the time. Are you?
All the time? No, I think so. There are clients who they and I cannot get beyond that wall sometimes. So, when someone is not willing, for me, coaching is really about someone who is wanting to be a willing partner in that relationship. When someone is sent, then in a way, it's inappropriate. but that's often what we have when we work in the corporate sector. So it is the building up of trust, which takes time and is essentially important. I suppose it depends largely on how, not just how they see you, the person who's in front of you sees you, but how you see yourself in that relationship. Who are you acting for? You know, the paying client or the person who's in front of you.
That's interesting, because I always tell the client that I'm theirs. That's who I'm there for, is them.
Yeah.
And that's where I always stay.
Yeah. Yeah.
But people don't necessarily believe what they hear, right?
Well, their own background and experience and how they got where they got to, it's almost as a disciplinary thing. You know, here's your coach, right? She'll put you right. And of course, that's not how we work, and it's not the intention of it. So it does take longer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump in, knowing that we're just a few minutes past the hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I think, Warren, you may have a few more minutes to stay on in case there are any individual questions, but I want to, at a minimum, bring us to a close and create the opportunity for those who absolutely need to leave to just slide away. So I want to say thank you, first of all, to you, Warren. What a privilege it has been to hear your story, your journey, and to have such a beautiful distillation of the essence of great coaching, and what that discovery process in arriving at your MCC offered you. It was obviously a rich journey as you've shared it, but it's been incredibly rich for all of us, and just from the comments and from the way that everyone's been hanging on every word, it's obvious that there's been a lot of richness for each of us on the line. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank everyone who joined in tonight. Everyone came from a different perspective, I'm sure, in terms of their own journey and where they are and what might be next for them. But I think you offered something for everyone. And folks are chiming in to say, great opportunity to listen and self-reflect. So thank you so much, Warren. I'm going to end our formal recording and close the webinar officially. But if someone wants to stay on just for a few more minutes, we'll keep the line open.
Sure. Thank you for the privilege of having me. It's been a lot of fun. Yeah, enjoyed that. Yeah, and now I'm